Hi, Mansi.
Hi, Shachi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Am I audible to you?
Yes,
That,
I can hear you fine.
awesome. Okay, so I guess we're on time. We let people plan as they do. And we'll start with a quick round of introductions. Is that
Yes,
all right?
let's do that.
I'll go first. Hi, everyone. My name is Shachi. I lead the governance vertical at Civis. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the open consultations. There are Civis is an organization, for those of you who don't know. We try and make public consultations and policy making more accessible to citizens. We like to bring the citizens' voices to policymakers. And we do that by facilitating consultations through our platform, civis.vote. You can check out all of the active consultations on our platform currently. There are 7, one of which is the proposed amendments to the Aadhar Authentication for Good Governance Rules 2020. That's what we're going to be discussing today. What it is, how it is, what happens. Mansi is our guide. Mansi, I'll let you introduce yourself now.
Thanks, Shachi. So my name is Mansi and I'm here representing my initiative, which is called Maadhyam. It is also a civic engagement initiative, which brings parliament and policy making closer to people and also enables critical citizen engagement with parliament and policy making. So thanks for inviting me over, Shachi. Looking forward to having this discussion with you.
Wonderful. So, all right. I'm going to start with a very basic question. And please feel free to explain this as simply as you possibly can for me as well as all our viewers. What is the Aadhar Act 2016 and what was its purpose? What was it set up with the motive of, right?
So, to understand the Aadhar Act of 2016, we actually need to go back to 2008 and 9 when the Aadhar project itself was started. And as many of you know, because almost all of us have enrolled for an Aadhar number, and some of us might remember what the process looked like. So we had to go to an enrollment center, we had to get our pictures taken, our iris scans were taken, our fingerprints were taken, all the 10 fingerprints, and then all of our details were filled up. And after some time, we got a card which had a 14-digit number in it, which was supposed to be our unique identity. So the authority which was set up to run this project is also called as the unique, UID. So the Unique Identification Authority of India. So the idea behind this was for each individual to have a unique ID through which they can be identified. But when in 2008-9, when this process was started, there was no law which laid down what were the responsibilities of the government, what were the powers and responsibilities of UIDAI, what would be, for instance, because a lot of sensitive information was being collected. So our iris scans, our fingerprints, all of these are categorized as biometric information, and the reason these were captured in the process were because it is understood that these are unique to every individual. So if your 10 set of fingerprints which are stored in some database, whenever you go to get yourself identified and you give your fingerprint, then out of the entire database it will match with your fingerprint because it's unique to you. So since this was very, like our biometrics, my biometric is considered to be a part of me, an extension of me. So obviously very, very sensitive information, and there was no law around who was handling this information, how was it being kept safe, what would happen if someone, if this database were to be breached, who would be responsible, etc. So there were efforts which were undertaken back in 2010 also, when there was a different government in power. They had also brought a bill on this project, but that bill faced a lot of resistance, and so it could not pass through Parliament. Then when the government changed in 2016, this government, the current government, brought an act. It's called the Aadhar Act of 2016, which they finally managed to get passed through Parliament. And if you go through the act, it basically lays down definitions of different terms. It lays down what are the sensitive biometric information, how will they be stored, what will be the responsibilities of different entities involved in the entire process, what would be if there are some offenses, for instance, if someone were to forge my identity, if someone were to leak my Aadhar number. So all of these are considered offenses under the Aadhar Act. So what would be the penalties for these offenses? So that is what was laid down in the Aadhar Act. And one very important thing which was laid down in the Aadhar Act was that there was an effort made to justify this act on the ground, that the government will use it for better targeting of welfare services.
Right.
So as we all know, government runs a lot of schemes and programs which are meant for the welfare of people. And according to the government, the argument was to make sure that the welfare was reaching the right person, the right recipient. Therefore, there was a need to properly identify people.
Right.
And that is why the government linked the Aadhar number, or required people to prove themselves through their Aadhar whenever they went to avail any government welfare service. So that was the purpose which was laid down in the Act.
The Aadhar Act of 26. Lovely.
Yeah.
Now let's come to a question that's closer to what we're discussing today. What is Aadhar authentication, and what is this proposed amendment? How is it done, and what is it that this proposed amendment is trying to change?
Yeah, so we'll come to the proposed amendment later, but to understand authentication, it's basically a way to prove your identity. So basically, if I were to, for instance, assume that I am someone who is beneficiary of a certain government welfare service like ration, free ration. So I am someone who is a below poverty line family member, and I am entitled to certain ration that I can get from the government. Now, whenever I'll go to a ration shop, I will have to prove that I am the person that I am claiming to be, that I am Mansi Verma, that you are Shachi. So we have to prove that. And how we do it is there are two mechanisms which are given in the Aadhar Act, how it identifies authentication. So one, it says that you give your biometric information, which means that there will be a machine. On that machine, I will put my thumbprint. And that thumbprint, that impression of that thumbprint will go back to the database, which is being maintained by UIDI. And that database will send back the information saying whether this thumbprint belongs to me or not, whether I am who I am claiming to be or not. So once I get a yes from there, then the ration shop dealer will give me my entitled ration after I have proved my identity. In case biometric verification is not available, then they can also take my Aadhar number and they can match the information that I am claiming along with the information that is being stored with UIDAI, and match if the person who is holding this Aadhar number is the same person whose data is entered into the system. And once that is done, I will be able to prove my identity. And once I have proved my identity, I will be able to avail whatever welfare service that I wanted to avail. So this is what authentication essentially means. So in very, very simple terms, it means being able to prove you are who you claim to be. Lovely. Essentially. And for that, a purpose has been laid down.
Right. Mansi, this obviously deals with, Aadhar is dealing with and storing a lot of personal, private, valuable information of so many millions and hopefully billion people, right? What are the precedents perhaps set by court, perhaps set by parliament on the right to privacy with respect to Aadhar? How are they being juggled together, and is there enough sort of room there to protect our privacy while availing all of these benefits?
Yeah. So actually this was one of the concerns because of which some people went to the court. And these petitions, so what came to be called as the Aadhar judgment, it came out in 2018, but it also goes back to 2009-10 when the Aadhar project came out. This was even before the act came out, but it was challenged because a lot of people were concerned that government is collecting a lot of data, and the government was also hiring a lot of private vendors to run their program to collect all that information. And all of this, as we just discussed, is very, very sensitive information, because if someone were actually be able to forge my thumbprint, my fingerprints, which are supposed to be unique to me, and later on in the discussion I'll also explain how this is actually happening and leading to some frauds. So if that happens, then that is a serious violation of my privacy. So this was one of the many concerns because of which some petitioners went to the court. And then the Aadhar Act came in 2016, also because when arguments were going on before the court, one of the biggest arguments was that all of this is happening without any law in place. So then the government brought the Aadhar Act of 2016, and then before the Supreme Court, we had two major judgments come out immediately after this act. One was the Puttaswamy judgment of 2017, which is very famously called as the right to privacy judgment, in which it was acknowledged that we have always had the right to privacy, which is an integral part of our right to life. And so if the government needs to do anything which will have which can even indirectly have an impact on infringing our right to privacy, then certain conditions have to be fulfilled. Right. Very quickly, I'll explain what those conditions are. So one is that this can only be done through a law. So there has to be a law that the government has to bring, that parliament has to pass, which says that so and so step has to be taken, which will achieve a certain purpose. So it should be for a very specific purpose, which is aligned to what the state is trying to achieve. So as an example, the argument that the state gives is that we need to be able to correctly identify who is receiving the welfare benefits, and to be able to do that, we need to we need people to give their to get themselves authenticated through Aadhaar, so that we can ensure that all the money that the government is spending on welfare, subsidy, etc., is going to the right person. Right. And there is no siphoning of funds that happens. So that was that was a purpose because of which something like this is being done. And the third is, which is very, very the most important point that needs to be proved, is that the step that you are taking, which will possibly infringe privacy, is proportional to the infringement that is going to happen. So which means that if it is possible for you to take a step which will have a much smaller impact on privacy and you will still achieve your purpose, then you should do that. And you should take a step, so like you should have exhausted every possible alternative to achieve the same purpose, and only then you should do something which can impact or infringe the right to privacy. So these three things were laid down by the Supreme Court in its 2017 Puttaswamy judgment, which was very, very, which was a milestone judgment. Then the Supreme Court invoked its own judgment when it started, when it was hearing the arguments against Aadhaar. And in the 2018 judgment, the Supreme Court said that, okay, the Aadhaar project is constitutional. It serves a purpose which the state justified by saying that we need to correctly identify the recipient. So it serves a purpose. And UIDAI, which is the authority responsible for it, is has a good system in place through which it is keeping all the biometric information safe. So so it's fine. But a very important point the Supreme Court said in its judgment, which was that the only reason something like this is being allowed is because, one, there is a law. Second is that it serves a purpose. And third is that it is proportional. But when it comes to private sector using Aadhaar, so for instance, up until that point of time, some of us might remember that if we went to buy a SIM card, we will have to, give our Aadhaar card ka photocopy or something like that, and they would refuse to accept any other government ID. So it's not like that Aadhaar is the only ID that gets issued by the government.
Absolutely.
All of us, almost all of us have multiple IDs. We have a driving license, we have a voter ID card, we have other kinds of identity ID documents as well. But there came to a point where if you had to go and open a bank account, they would only accept an Aadhaar. If you had to buy a SIM card, they would only accept an Aadhaar. And this was particularly struck down by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said that one, there was no law which mandated it for people to give their Aadhaar if they went to open a bank account or buy a SIM card. Second, it did not serve any state purpose. I mean, these were private entities which were using it, maybe because it was easier for them to fulfill their KYC norms, the know your customer norms, etc. But ease of private businesses is not really a state purpose. It's not something for which you need to, because the Supreme Court particularly highlighted that we are looking at an ID through which people's sensitive biometric information is stored. So while that information, that database is being kept secure by the UIDAI, but it was quite possible that if people were just handing out photocopies of their Aadhaar card left, right, and center for everything that they do, then that can easily be misused.
Right.
And that kind of infringement of privacy cannot be justified on the ground that some private companies, it will be easier for them to fulfill their know your customer requirements. So while the Supreme Court, I'm just wrapping it up. So while the Supreme Court said that the government using Aadhaar for its, for better targeting of its welfare services, even though there were a lot of objections to even this argument, but we can park that for the time being. So the Supreme Court said that even if, while government may be permitted to use Aadhaar for better targeting of the welfare services, private sector using Aadhaar cannot really be justified.
Right.
So that is what the Supreme Court said.
Now, there was an Aadhaar Amendment Act in 2019 as well, right? Which was also challenged before the Supreme Court. So can you tell us a little bit about what the Amendment Act was, what it brought about, and why was it then subsequently challenged?
So after the judgment of 2018, of course, we had the elections, and then the new government was formed. So they brought a bill in Parliament through which they said that the three concerns that the Supreme Court said. One was that how can banks and telecom service providers, how can they insist on people giving their Aadhaar without there being a law in place? It does not serve any purpose, and it is not proportional to the risk of infringement of privacy. So they said that in compliance with the Supreme Court judgment, we are bringing a law and we are laying down the purpose. So these two things they said that we are trying to address through this amendment. So what the amendment, very briefly, what the amendment says is that beyond the government also, if there is any entity which wants to use Aadhar authentication, which basically means that if they want people to prove their identity with the help of Aadhaar, then they will have to request to the government that let us allow us to use Aadhar authentication for the purpose of giving these services to people.
Right.
Once they apply, then and for what purposes they can apply, the Act says that these purposes will be laid down in rules which the government will come out with later.
Right.
So this Act basically said three things. One was that any entity beyond the government can also request to be allowed to do authentication. Second, the purposes for which it will do, that will be laid down in the rules. And third, it amended through the Aadhar Amendment Act, it amended two other acts as well, through which they said that banks and telecom service providers can ask for Aadhaar for giving their services, but it will be voluntary. So people can refuse to give their Aadhaar also. If anyone is okay with giving their Aadhaar as an identity document when they go to open a bank account or buy a SIM card, they are free to. But if they do not want to, they cannot be compelled to do it. So by doing this, the government said that the Supreme Court's concern was that this cannot be a mandate, this cannot be made mandatory. So as long as we leave it to the people, that you take a call. If you want to do it, you can do it. If you don't want to do it, you don't do it. So by doing that, we are not violating the Supreme Court's judgment. But as soon as the act was passed, it was challenged before the Supreme Court. On the ground, there were several grounds, but one of the main grounds was that Supreme Court had specifically prohibited. The Supreme Court had limited the use of Aadhaar by the government. So the Supreme Court said that for welfare services, better targeting, you use Aadhaar. Okay, we have accepted your argument. You go ahead and do it. But the Supreme Court specifically said that this will be the limit of Aadhaar usage. Aadhaar usage is not supposed to go beyond this. So now for the government to find some indirect way of actually trying to do what the Supreme Court prohibited it from doing was one of the grounds on which the Amendment Act was challenged before the Supreme Court, and that challenge is still pending.
Right. Okay. Now, let's come to the second point that you mentioned that the Amendment Act said, right, which is that the purposes shall be defined in rules that the government will come up with in a while. Now, obviously, those Aadhar Authentication for Good Governance rules did come out in 2020. What did they say? What are those purposes that were specified, and what are some of the associated issues with these rules that came out?
So then in 2020, and I think it's also important to notice that, it was slightly problematic and concerning that, just when, so I think it was somewhere in July or August of 2020. So we were in the midst of a pandemic, and in between that, and since, your organization is also an organization which works to advance consultations, this was a bill which was, these rules were brought without any consultation also. And so what these rules essentially said was that if there was, so they started with government department. So, the Supreme Court not just limited the use of Aadhaar to be used by the government, but also for certain specific services. Because if you read the Aadhaar Act, it says that, and actually this was one more point I forgot to mention earlier, very quickly I'll mention it here. One of the arguments, when the Aadhaar bill was brought, at that time in Lok Sabha, sorry, just a second.
Yeah.
Sorry. So when the Aadhaar Act was brought in 2016, at that time, the bill, while the government managed to get the bill through Lok Sabha easily because it had those numbers, but in Rajya Sabha, the government felt that it might face some resistance. So one of the ways that they used to avoid that was that they got the bill certified as a money bill by the speaker, and their argument was that since this is since Aadhaar project is primarily meant for better targeting of welfare services, so that the government's the taxpayers' money is not wasted, and this taxpayers' money is coming from the Consolidated Fund of India, and so this is a money bill. Now this argument was accepted by the majority judgment of the Supreme Court in the Aadhaar judgment. So the 2018 judgment was essentially 5 judges who gave that judgment, out of which 4 accepted the government's argument, upheld Aadhaar as constitutional, but one, who was Justice Chandrachud, who's the current Chief Justice of India, he dissented and he gave a separate judgment in which he basically said that Aadhaar project is unconstitutional. But anyway, so
just so that we don't lose that.
Yeah. So coming back to the rules. So now while the Supreme Court allowed government to use Aadhaar, but again it was meant for very specific purposes,
Right.
and as the government said, better targeting of welfare services, so that all the money that is going out from the Consolidated Fund of India is properly spent.
Right.
So any other kind of government service in which this consideration is not there, for that you shouldn't need to use Aadhaar because you yourself are saying better targeting of services. But through the good governance rules, they basically said that not just those government ministries and departments which were specifically allowed by the Supreme Court to use Aadhaar, but even other government ministries and departments can also request that for whatever service we are offering to the people, we want to identify them through Aadhaar authentication. And again, the same process will be followed, that if they request, and they will have to prove that it justifies a certain purpose, and so for that, and for that, three purposes were laid down in the rules. So the rules said that if it is for good governance, if it is for prevention of dissipation of social welfare benefits, which is the same argument around that government's taxpayers' money should not be wasted, and enablement of innovation, spread of knowledge, etc. Now, what was concerning was that none of these terms were defined anywhere. So these terms are not defined in the Act. These terms are not defined in the rules. So what is good governance? Anything that the government will do is good, should ideally be good governance only. The government itself will not indulge in bad governance. So it was very difficult to, so it felt like that, these purposes were laid down as a formality. And if any government entity were to actually apply and say that we want to do Aadhaar authentication for any government service that we offer, how will UIDAI or the government apply its mind? How will they say that, okay, it justifies a purpose that has been laid down? Because these purposes are so vague and so wide. What is innovation? Anything can be innovation. What is spread of knowledge? So these were the concerns. But the rule said that all of this will be voluntary. So even if a government department is allowed to use Aadhaar authentication, they cannot say that until you show your Aadhaar or until you prove yourself through Aadhaar authentication, you cannot avail of this government service. So it was supposed to be voluntary. But as we have seen, in case of Aadhaar in the past as well, that voluntary by default becomes mandatory. So, and one of the concerns is that there is no way to complain against it. So UIDAI or the government does not have a functional grievance redressal mechanism. And so if someone is even being forced to give their Aadhaar, then they will not be able to complain and say that actually it's voluntary, I can refuse to give, and I can still prove myself through any other government ID and avail of that government service. So this is what the 2020 rule said. And now I'm assuming your next question is going to be about the proposed changes. So I'll quickly come to that.
Before we get so there were challenges raised on particularly the big issue with the previous set of rules that was released in 2020 was that all of the terms were vague and open for interpretation, and they were not defined anywhere in the Act or the rules. Right? Now, coming to the proposed changes, are these changes addressing these concerns that were risen?
So no, on your first question, they are not addressing these concerns. But what these changes are now doing is that the 2020 rule said that any government ministry or department can use, and now they are saying even any entity which is not a government ministry or department, which on the ground would mean any private entity as well, can now request that we be allowed to identify our customers, do our know your customers through Aadhaar authentication. And for this, they have added one purpose to the rules, and this is said promoting ease of living and to enable people to get better services. But again, it is not very clear how this will enable ease of living. What exactly is ease of living? Were people really finding it difficult to avail any private service by showing other IDs? is proving themselves through Aadhaar actually going to improve their experience of availing a private service? So, I mean, there is no, like, even when consultations are done, the government ideally should release some kind of white paper, just justifying why they are doing what they are doing. But all of that is all of that is entirely missing. So the concerns which were there with the 2020 rules still stand. And now what has happened is that it is now being expanded to the private sector. And the two, three main concerns which arise because of this is one, that you are openly, like, the government is very clearly going against what the Supreme Court laid down.
Right.
The government is very clearly going against what itself said when it justified the Aadhaar project. So you justify the project by saying that the taxpayers' money should not be wasted, that the government should be able to better identify people for welfare services, and then now you say ease of living and private sector should also use it. And third is that in the last couple of years we have actually seen a lot of Aadhaar related frauds coming up. So just today on Twitter I was reading, someone had shared their experience where money was taken out of their bank account and they did not even come to know. They only came to know when they came to get their passbook updated. That's when they came to know that actually the balance in their account is zero. And they were told that someone in some other state, they may have forged their fingerprints. And there is something called Aadhaar enabled payment system, where basically if you have enabled this system in your bank account, then all you need to do is that you just need to prove yourself through your fingerprint and you can retrieve money.
Right.
Otherwise we go to an ATM, we have to insert a card, we have to put an OTP. So actually you can avoid all of that, just put your fingerprint and get money. But this has actually led to a lot of frauds. I mean, in the last 1 year, if you just pick up a newspaper, you will actually find so many reports of this happening. And of course, in a lot of these things, the police has acted, the cybercrime has been giving, warnings to people, has been asking them to be careful, to have their, but again, see, the thing is, if as of now, we are giving our fingerprints at very limited places, right? If we are availing of any government service, if we are, for instance, if we are signing a document, etc., if we are buying a property, we have to sign a government document. Sometimes we have to give our fingerprints there. So as of now, we are giving our fingerprints, our biometrics at very, very limited places. Despite that, so many frauds are happening.
Right.
Now imagine the scope of frauds that might happen if we go around for every private service that we are doing. If we go around giving our fingerprints, now on the face of it, it might seem like things are becoming easy, but actually we are making ourselves very, very vulnerable to more such frauds. So our concern is that until and unless you figure out, unless the government finds a way for these kind of frauds to be prevented, for these kind of loopholes to be plugged, for for the government to address the concerns because of which the Supreme Court prohibited private sector from using Aadhaar, unless that can happen, something like this should not be expedited in this manner. So that is basically the main concern.
Right. And Mansi, what are the checks and balances in the system as they currently stand? Right? So at the moment, the rules, the entity has to seek permission from the concerned government department to be able to authenticate that permission. There's only one step. Is that correctly? What are there any other checks and balances in place to protect the privacy of the system? Are there any other sort of pitfalls here?
Yeah. So it does say that before the government actually allows them to use Aadhaar authentication, the UIDI and the government will have to be convinced that they have enough data protection, privacy measures in place. So that whatever, for instance, even if they are not doing it through, by giving your fingerprints, even if you are doing Aadhaar authentication by giving a photocopy of your Aadhaar card, but we know that even that can be misused. So what kind of mechanisms does any private entity have in place to keep all the data safe? etc., is what the central government and UIDI will have to ensure before they can actually allow them to
But
use the Aadhar authentication.
of uh, safety measures that private entities have to have in place. There aren't any prescribed measures. That's up to the discretion
So,
authority.
yeah, and that's very important because we also, as of now, don't have a data protection law in place. So that's very important because, as some of you might know, the data protection law has also been in the making for since
It
2018.
was just
And even as of now, we don't actually have a law in place. So that data protection law can actually lay down what would be the responsibilities of any entity which is collecting a lot of data. How will they keep that data safe? What will be our rights as data, as data principals? Because it is my data after all which is being used. So what right do I have over that data? Can I go and file a complaint against an entity which does not keep my data safe? What penalties can be imposed on them? So all of that is what can actually be laid down, is actually supposed to be laid down in a data protection law,
right.
which we don't have in place as of now. So that's also one of the concerns, that actually things need to happen in a sequential manner. You bring out a data protection law in place, let all the private sector companies comply with that law, because even compliance with that law will take some time. You will have to give them some time to revamp their procedures, their structures according to the law, and then you allow them to handle such sensitive information, which is actually a very, very vulnerable to misuse and fraud. So
Right.
that sequence is not being followed here.
So as I understand it, we're trying to put the horse before the cart, right? Or the cart before the horse.
Yeah.
So here's my question now. These rules seem to pertain to private entities and how they will be authenticating and so on. And at the surface or the seemingly, they don't relate directly to the citizen. But of course, like you just explained to us, that this has to do with our data and how that's going to be used, and that's going to be used by third parties or whether it's governments, or who's deciding what to do with our data. So that's one reason for us to participate. Can you find any other reasons why we should rush to the consultation and give our thoughts and opinions?
Absolutely. Like you said that it is after all our data, and all of this is supposed to be for our benefit, right? So what the rules also say is ease of living for us, better access to better services for us. But if it is actually making us more vulnerable, instead of giving ease of living or better services, then that is a very, very strong reason for us to share our opinion and feedback with the government. And someone has also asked this question, and I think I'll address your and their question together. They've also asked what could be the potential concerns if Aadhaar is used as the primary ID. Is identity theft the only one? Identity theft is definitely one of the biggest concerns, but also one of the concerns is surveillance. So what happens is that the more, so we all are aware of how our activity on the net is tracked, right? A lot of a lot of the time that we spend on the internet is actually used to show us ads, etc. And a lot of us sometimes get creeped out by the fact that we were just speaking to the phone on someone about something, and suddenly an ad popped up about something similar. So, we are all like, we know that we are constantly being watched, our behavior is being tracked, and all of this is being used simply for the commercial benefit of private entities. So we have basically been reduced to an asset that needs to be exploited.
Right.
Now, the more data that we give out, the more, for instance, I can, like, biometric information, the scope of the kind of misuse that information can be led to, the kind of, and a lot of, we know that on the dark net, a lot of data is being traded, for a lot of sinister purposes. And I think we need to be really, really very careful about, how casually our data is being dealt with, and how it comes back to bite us. So we have to be very careful about the fact that it can enable a lot of surveillance as well, the way this is being done. So that's why also, again, the point about why we need to have a data protection law in place.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, A, we need to protect our data and also understand how it's going to now be used. And I think we'll pause here. It's been, we'll see if there are any questions coming up from the audience. This is the time to type them out and I'm happy to address them. If not, for all of those who are watching, please go on to civis.vote. You can submit your comments, you can give your feedback, you can write about everything that you learned today and all your opinions about the proposed amendments for good governance rules. And there are only 3 days left for the consultation. So please do it now, please do it soon, so that we can make sure that your voices reach the lawmakers are actually. Thank you so much, Mansi. This was extremely, extremely, so really, really helpful. Very simply, I'm sure most people took a lot away from this discussion. I don't think there are
Thank you.
coming up.
Yeah.
Yeah, go on.
So thanks, Shachi, and I would, just like add to what you said about, why people should share their feedback and concerns. Also because, usually, and this is something that I often say whenever people ask why we should participate in consultations. It is because lawmaking is a very, very expensive process, and by expensive, I don't just mean all the time and effort that the government has spent on creating these laws and the process, but also the cost to us when these laws are implemented. So if for instance these rules get implemented in this form without these concerns getting addressed, then it can prove to be very costly to us. So we have to always keep these costs in mind, that it is, if feedback given in time, feedback given before the rules can become the law, I mean these are at the draft stage right now, so before they can be finalized, the feedback can prevent a lot of future cost that ultimately we the citizens have to bear. So that is, that should be your motivation to share your concerns and feedback with the government. I hope a lot of you will share your concerns with civis through their platform, and they'll make sure that it reaches the government. And I hope you all found the discussion useful. Please do engage with this consultation. It's very, very important for all of us. And thanks to civis for organizing this discussion today.
Thank you, Mansi. We really appreciate it. Thanks for your time. Good night.
Thank you.